Hi everyone, this is Liz Bothwell from Waste 360. I'm honored to moderate this session today, and it's about stuff. It fills our homes, it fills the back seats of our cars, it fills up our offices and piles on top of our desks. As waste and recycling professionals, it's easy to forget the stuff that's piled into our bins started out life as something somebody actually used and some stuff that someone wanted. Adam Minter, our wonderful keynote today, will be the first to admit that he's occasionally forgotten about those facts too. For nearly 2 decades, he's been one of the foremost chroniclers of the globalizing recycling trade. The great-grandson of an immigrant scrap metal peddler, he began his journalism career as a freelancer with Scrap and later Recycling International. Today, he's a columnist with Bloomberg Opinion, where he writes about a range of topics from Asian politics to the always complex politics of waste and recycling. He is also the author of 2 renowned books about the recycling industry, Junkyard Planet, Travels in the Billion-Dollar Trash Trade, and his new book, Secondhand, Travels in the New Global Garage Sale. Today, Adam will talk about the journey he took as he shifted from thinking about, in his words, junk as junk to junk as stuff that people use and reuse and love. Enjoy this session, and thanks for watching. And before Adam begins, I just wanted to talk about a couple of housekeeping items. We've added some helpful attachments, which are available through the Resources tab at the bottom of your screen. You can find related content from today's speakers as well. And we would love for you to share this on social, so please do. You'll be entered to win a WasteExpo Together Online kit. You can tag WasteExpo or use the hashtags WasteExpo or WasteExpo Together Online. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, Liz, for the kind introduction, and I'm so glad to be here speaking at WasteExpo. Thanks to WasteExpo for inviting me. You know, I sure wish we could all be together in New Orleans like we had originally planned, but I'm really glad that we have the chance to be together in this format. And who knows, in the next year or two, we might have the chance to repeat it. And I look forward to meeting everybody who's with me today watching this presentation. So the title of this presentation is an unusual one, Stuff, the Hidden Borderland of Waste and Recycling. And it's unusual because it's kind of personal. The way I've always done my journalism is to personalize it. I like to tell stories about people, companies, and phenomenon, and really give people a sense of not just what the graphs look like, but what the people and the entities involved in them look like. And what I'm going to tell you a story about today is a story about a few people, but in many ways it's also my story and how I came from being a recycling reporter to being a stuff reporter and thinking about things a little bit differently than I had as somebody who grew up in the waste and recycling industry. So when I say it's the hidden borderland, you know, it may be hidden to you, it may not be, but it certainly was hidden to me until I really started thinking about things in a different way a few years ago. And so I'm going to today present to you sort of that journey, at least one component of it. And I hope you can take away some lessons from this and also just enjoy the journey that I had, and maybe it'll encourage you to take your own kind of recycling, waste, and stuff journey. So I want to start sort of with my prior life. This is a photo I took in 2007 outside of Guangzhou, China. At the time, I was working on an assignment for a magazine, Scrap Magazine, looking at a scrapyard down there. And a friend of mine who owned this scrapyard heard that I was at a competing scrapyard. And he said, "You've got to come see my new scrapyard." So I like scrapyards. As I mentioned, I grew up in a scrap recycling family. And I said, "Sure, if you can pick me up, let's do it." So he sent over a car and took me to his new scrapyard in a place called Shansui, which is a port some listeners might be aware of. And, you know, as we walked in, he pointed out to that pile you see in the picture. That turns out to be several shredded helicopters that had been imported from Los Angeles. And that's one of the reasons why I like going to scrapyards, is because you just never know what you're going to find within them. So we took a walk around the yard, and aside from helicopters, shredded helicopters, we saw this. And from a distance, I thought that I was looking at a pile of extension cords, which is something that I'm quite familiar with seeing in scrapyards. And anybody who goes to scrapyards knows that they're a hot commodity, especially a few years ago. But as we got closer, I saw they weren't extension cords. They were Christmas tree lights. Now, I grew up in a scrapyard, and I've thought I've seen everything, and every few months I find out that there is something new for me to see. And this was actually a surprise to me. I had never seen so many Christmas tree lights in one place, whether it was at Costco or at a scrapyard. You can see what that pile looked like. And my immediate thought was, where does this stuff get recycled? This is going to be great. At the time, I was thinking about writing a book about recycling. I thought, I'm going to tell the story of Christmas tree lights and how they are recycled. So I asked the owner of this yard, can you take me to where this stuff is actually processed? And he said, no, we have to go to dinner. So I sort of dropped it. And then a few years later, I started thinking about writing a book again. And I needed to find somebody who could show me how Christmas tree lights are recycled. And I was introduced to this gentleman whose name is Johnson Zheng. Now, Johnson is originally from southern China, a town called Shantou. He had moved to Vancouver many years ago and became a traveling scrap trader. And what that means is he would get into a car. He's not doing this anymore, but at the time he would get into a car, and for about 6 months out of the year, he would drive around the United States going scrapyard to scrapyard to scrapyard, and there are hundreds of scrapyards, paying cash, meaning immediate wire transfers for scrap metal that he would then arrange immediate shipment for back to China, to places like that yard in Jiansui. And one of the things that he liked to ship, and he really specialized in because he had good markets for it in China, was Christmas tree wire. So there's Johnson at work. And he's looking at some wire that he's about to buy. And so I went on the road with Johnson for a week, and he said at the end of it, he would show me how Christmas tree lights are recycled. So we traveled all around the United States. These I remember quite distinctly are Christmas tree lights in St. Louis, Christmas tree lights in Kansas City, and a big pile of Christmas tree lights in North Carolina. And if you know Christmas tree lights, or if you don't know Christmas tree lights, this is just the beginning. It's a massive, massive load of stuff that's out there. So at the end of traveling around and seeing piles like this, I said to Johnson, okay, I get it. There's a lot of Christmas tree lights out here now. Can we see where it's processed? And he said, okay, when you get back to China, and at the time I was living in Shanghai, he said, you call my friend down south, and you'll fly down and you'll visit him, and he'll take you to his Christmas tree light factory. So I said, great. So I'm going to go down to southern China and see a Christmas tree light factory. And so that's what I did. I flew back to China, back to Shanghai, spent a couple weeks at home, and then called his friend Raymond. That's his English name. And Raymond said, come on down and I'll show you my Christmas tree light recycling factory. So if you've ever spent any time in China going to factories, you know what this is. This is the meal you have to have before you go and visit the factory, because let's face it, nobody's going to let you into their factory, Christmas tree lights or otherwise, unless they know they can trust you. And one of the great things about China is we learn to trust each other in many cases over good meals with some good wine or beer or baijiu, which is the local liquor. So here we are with Raymond's family, and like most recycling businesses, including the one I grew up in, it's a family business. And so this is largely Raymond's family plus a couple of friends. And Raymond is very camera shy, so he's the one guy you can't see in the photo really. You can see his legs in khakis over there in the lower left corner. But after this meal, they decided that I was okay, and especially because I was Johnson's friend, I could then go and see the Christmas tree light recycling factory. So before I show you how Christmas tree lights were recycled at this time in southern China, I want to show you a quick graph, and we're not going to do too many graphs today, so don't worry. This is the U.S. exports of all scrap to China from 1996 to 2015. And it includes everything: plastics, metals, paper, cardboard, rubber, anything that could be recycled. And we all know kind of this story. I mean, it's an extraordinary story from, very modest beginnings there in 1996 to the great boom, which really peaked about 2010, 2011 during the Chinese stimulus after the Great Recession following the Lehman crash. When I visited Raymond, you could see down there, it was right around 2009, and things were starting to heat up after that crash. So it was a really interesting time, and this was a great system that benefited both sides. Americans recycle a lot of their own stuff, process a lot of their own stuff before China's import restrictions around 2/3, and then it exported stuff. And about 1/3 of that stuff got exported, and China needed raw materials. So it was a sustainable way for them to get raw materials. And so we can see sort of, the beginnings and inklings of something happening on the other end, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But first, I want to show you how Christmas tree lights were recycled in southern China, in the late 2000s, early part of the last decade. I'm going to talk through this, and then I'll show you what the commodity looks like once it's been cleaned up afterwards. But I'm going to hit play here, and we'll see how they recycled Christmas tree lights in this part of China. So the first thing you do is you get a bundle of Christmas tree lights, and you toss them into a shredder. You get a bundle of them, toss them in there, and that's not smoke, that's steam, because there's blades spinning around in there, and you need to keep them cool, so you pump water into that, and that's what the steam is. What comes out is this kind of goop of plastic, glass, and copper and water, and this gentleman you see shoveling it onto this table. This table is tilted upwards and the water shoots up. It's kind of like panning for gold, and the light stuff, the plastic, gets shot right off the sides of it. And you can see that orange streak there? That's the copper. It's heavier, and so it doesn't fall off as easily from the table. And you can see she's shoveling pure copper there. And the camera's about to pan down, and you will see clean copper. There you go. It's a great system, and it's especially as a system that's an improvement on what they used to do with Christmas tree lights, which was put them in a pile, pour gas on them, and fire. In this case, you get the copper, and you also get the insulation, and that insulation, at least at the time, was being resold to a slipper sole company, and so it was being made into slipper sole. So it's fairly sustainable. I also always get asked about the water. What happens to the water? Are they dumping it into a nearby river? No, they're not. Actually, the water's being recirculated through the system. So that's a net plus to it as well. And here's another one from a neighboring factory in the town where Raymond's Christmas tree light recycling facility has 10 more, and they would process millions of pounds of these things a year. So this is just an easier picture for you to see that streak in the water shooting up the table. So this was great. It worked beautifully for everybody. Americans couldn't afford to, couldn't affordably recycle their Christmas tree lights, so they sent them to China, where China would recycle them, and the copper would be sold to Christmas tree light manufacturers who would sell them back to the United States. It was and still is the circular economy, and I always find it interesting that people keep talking about the need to invent circular economies, in North America and Europe, but we already had one, and it dates back decades. It's just not quite the one that people thought that they were going to get and that they wanted. So this system worked really great, but then it started breaking down, and I want to talk to you about why it broke down, and we're going to get into stuff in just a moment. But, right around the time that I visited Raymond's factory, you can see something changed in China, and that is the population started aging. This is working age population, 15 to 64. And starting right around 2010, China had fewer and fewer working people as a percent of their total population. That started pushing the cost of making things and processing things upwards. You can see China is the black graph here. This is index unit labor costs in the manufacturing sector. And look at how those prices have gone up since the mid-2000s compared to Canada, South Korea, Germany, and the United States, countries that had offshored manufacturing and recycling. And then you have this, and this is also very telling. As those manufacturing costs go up, China's economic growth starts slowing down. And this is a graph pre-COVID. I'm not going to talk about COVID, but we know what COVID's done to economies around the world. Now, the reason Chinese economic growth slowed down wasn't just because of labor. It's also because they've already built most of their subways. There's only so many subway systems you can build. You can only build so many superhighways. So a lot of the infrastructure spending that demanded all the scrap, was ending. And so the Chinese economic growth slowed down. And then at the same time, something really interesting was happening in North America. I think there's a few people listening to this who know what this graph is. It's basically just a graph of how much Americans were throwing away and how much they're recycling. And it's interesting. At the very time that China is starting to slow down in its consumption of these things, Americans are throwing away and recycling more than ever. And when you think about it from a purely business standpoint, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It also doesn't make a lot of environmental sense. But, if you're an oil driller and your primary customer is starting to use less oil, you don't start drilling more oil wells. But that's something that we were doing in the United States as this Chinese slowdown was happening, is that we were collecting trash better and we were expanding recycling programs. And you can kind of see where the trouble was going to start. And this is all the trouble starting before the Chinese ban happened. You can see the drop-off was considerable. And anybody who was in the recycling business at the time was feeling it. Prices were going down, and there was a very good reason for that. There was less demand and more supply. Less demand in China, more supply from North America. And then you add in not just the ban, but the inklings of the ban, starting 6 months before the bans came online, and you've got a recipe for trouble. And they say China upended the global recycling industry with the waste import ban. This was sort of the narrative that was around there. But I would say that there were factors upending it beforehand. I think you could sort of call the ban sort of just the pinnacle of what was already occurring that led to this decline from 2011. So for me, as somebody who grew up in the recycling industry and who grew up around, people who did hauling, and, one of my family's best friends, owned a landfill, I was looking at these graphs and really kind of wondering what we were going to do. Of course, we could say, as in North America, well, we should expand our recycling programs. We should have more processing in North America. Easier said than done. And I think we've all learned over the last couple of years that recycling is an important, essential component to environmental stewardship, to our waste management regimes, but it is not in and of itself sufficient to take care of the issue. And so I thought, what is going to happen to this stuff? I mean, are we going to continue consuming at the same rate? Where is this stuff going to go? And the answer for me came really from a place that I wasn't expecting to find it. It came from Star Wars. Now, I'm sure I just lost a couple people by putting that up, and I ask that you bear with me because I really do have a point here, because it's not just about my journey, but I think there's some lessons in Star Wars. There were lessons for me that readjusted the direction of my career, and I'm not kidding. And I think, I don't know that necessarily people are taking, in the waste and recycling industry, are taking lessons from Star Wars, but in many cases, you are starting to see some of the things that occurred in the Star Wars galaxy sort of happening in waste and recycling. And so I want to just explain to you and explore this a little bit as a parallel and as a fun parallel for what some of the things going on in waste recycling and stuff in the United States. So I am a lifelong fan of these films. I remember very clearly my father taking me to see the first one. And one of the things I've noticed in every Star Wars film, 1 through 9, is that you have junkyards, or at least people who collect junk in them. This is Episode 1, not one of the finer films, but it does make an interesting point. You see here a junkyard in the film, and the amazing thing about junkyards in the Star Wars series is they are piled with junk, but you don't see much processing. It's just stuff piling up. Nobody's melting it down. Nobody's chopping it. There are no MRFs. It's just sort of sitting around, and I had never really thought about why until a couple years ago. Let's jump to Episode 4, the first Star Wars film. These are the Jawas. I come from a long line of scrap recyclers, immigrant recyclers. My great-grandfather was a scrap peddler on the streets of Galveston, Texas. And so whenever I see the Jawas scavenging in the desert of Tatooine, I think of my great-grandfather scavenging on the streets of Galveston, Texas. I'm not kidding you. And they have their junk truck. He had his junk truck. It's a sand crawler. And inside that junk truck, you would find droids, you'd find stuff. But again, for such a large junk truck, it had an incredible dearth of processing equipment. This stuff wasn't being recycled. It was being held onto and in many cases repaired. But But for me, the key to understanding what was going on in the Star Wars universe came in The Empire Strikes Back, a film that my mother took me to see. I remember it very distinctly. And this scene, which I didn't really mull very much at the time I first saw it, but I did a few years ago when I rewatched the film. In The Empire Strikes Back, we learn that a Star Destroyer does not go into hyperspace until it dumps its trash. And so, and I never thought about that, but if you watch the film, and I did, a few years ago, this scene, and I started zooming in, I paused it, zoomed in at the trash, look at that. It's all steel scrap. It's perfectly good steel scrap. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all, because if you're in recycling, you know that you should be able to take that stuff to your local scrapyard and at least get a few pennies off it. But the Star Destroyer, for whatever reason, decided to dump that perfectly good steel scrap into space. And that struck me as very curious. Next up, we have a Star Destroyer grounded in, this is episode 7 on the planet of Jakku. And again, you would think that they would want to recycle this. In fact, every time I see this image, I think of this. And some of you may know what this is. This is a picture of a ship that's been beached on Alang in southern India. And what they do in Alang, India, is they take these apart piece by piece and recycle the steel. But on Jakku, they just leave them alone. And then we meet Ray. Now, Ray is sort of my scrap recycling hero. And Ray in episode 7 really helped to shift my thinking on recycling. Ray drives up to one of these giant Star Destroyers grounded on Jakku, and instead of cutting it up with a blowtorch and taking the steel to the recycler, she goes inside it and starts cutting parts from it. And she takes these parts and she sells them. Why? Because they can be reused. They're reusables. They're stuff. They're not recyclables. There's some value in them, a value add that goes beyond what their value was as a commodity. And that gave me real pause, and I started watching the films again, sort of with a new eye, thinking, there's something to the Star Wars economy here that I've been missing. We've all been missing. What is it? Well, one, I think it's sort of hinted at in this scene, which is on Mustafar in episode 3. This is the volcano planet, and the volcano planet is filled with volcanoes that are mined for raw materials. Essentially, if you need steel, you just go into Mustafar, put a ladle into the lava, and you have your steel, which means that the price of commodities on Mustafar and in the Star Wars universe is probably pretty cheap. You don't have to pay very much for steel. And if that's the case, you're not going to recycle steel. And it's kind of like the situation we have right now with plastics. It's not worth very much. It's like a lot of electronics. They're not very worth very much. Which brings us then to Chewbacca. So instead of learning how to price out copper, Chewbacca instead, as we learn throughout the films, is a skilled mechanic. He looks at these things as value add, and when he sees a torn up copper C-3PO, he doesn't say, let's toss it into the recycling bin and see how many pennies we can get per pound for all that copper. He says, I'm going to reassemble this because there's a value add here, and it doesn't belong in the waste stream. And we find this throughout the Star Wars universe. Everybody knows, instead of how to sort their stuff into the correct bin, they know how to fix stuff. Han Solo knows how to fix stuff on the Millennium Falcon. And of course, Rey, and this, I love this scene, knows in her roots as a recycler, as somebody who spent her whole life before going to the stars scavenging for reusables, she knows how to fix things. She knows how to bypass the compressor. All right, so enough Star Wars. Let's go to Vermont. Let's first have a drink of water here. Hold on a sec. So this is a scrap warehouse in Vermont. It's actually an electronic scrap warehouse, belongs to a company by the name of Goodpoint Recycling, owned by a gentleman by the name of Robin Ingenthron. And Goodpoint Recycling is like most electronics recyclers. They will do take-back programs, they'll do drives, they'll work with counties, and they will send stuff to be recycled properly. But Goodpoint has been unabashed over the years that they also export their electronics to developing countries, in particular Ghana. And so I got to know Robin Ingenthron, the owner of Goodpoint Recycling, and I got him to take me to Ghana to see what happens to this stuff that gets shipped there. Because let's face it, the idea of exporting electronics to Ghana immediately brings images of this to the minds of most waste and recycling professionals. In fact, it brings images of this to the who even aren't familiar with the industry. They think of it as dumping, and they think of it as, a kind of pollution. What you're seeing here, this is my photo, is a part of Accra, Ghana. That's the capital of Ghana, called Agbogbloshie. And over the years, this area has become known as the world's largest electronics dumping site. It's not. It's not even close. There are electronics warehouses all over the United States that are multiple times bigger than Agbogbloshie. It's basically a waste dump. It's a landfill, an incineration site for the garbage of the people of Accra, Ghana. And when something is so broken that it can no longer be fixed, it may make its way down there. But nobody imports stuff into Ghana. It costs about $5,000 a container to go from Boston to Accra, for example. Nobody does that so that they can burn the stuff in a dump in Ghana. It wouldn't make economic sense. But then it begs the question, then what happens to all those electronics that folks like Robin and other exporters send to Ghana? And that's what I wanted to get a picture of. So Robin's electronics, when he exports them to Ghana, also go through the port of Tema, which serves Accra, but they more often than not head north. And here's a friend of mine and a friend of Robin's by the name of Olu Orga. And Olu is a lovely guy. He started out actually working at Agbogbloshie in this dump, collecting scrap from the streets of Accra. And he would take it and he would strip it and he would resell it. And he grew bigger and bigger, and he started dealing in electronics, and he got to know how to fix them. And he moved home to Tamale, where he works with a couple of businesses, helping them import computers, monitors, and other electronics that are then resold in smaller towns and across Ghana for reuse. There's no point in setting the stuff on fire if you've brought it all the way up there. There's huge demand for it. Just like folks everywhere, folks in Ghana want to get onto the information superhighways. And so people like Olu help them do it. And you can see here's Olu. This was actually taken from Olu's WhatsApp, where he was sent out a message to all of his friends and customers. They overlap quite heavily, saying what he and his partners now have in inventory, and come on down and buy yourself a new computer that's been imported from Vermont. This is Tamale, Ghana. This is the third largest city in Ghana. I've spent quite a bit of time here getting to know what happens to electricity and the journey of our stuff. You can see the great mosque of Tamale in the background there. But Olu's main partner in this business is a company called Shindiba Enterprises, and they have a storefront on the street, which is the main street of Tamale right here. And if you go in there, you can see what's going on. The guy in the yellow shirt is Mr. Shindiba himself, and he is filling out an invoice because he just sold a used computer to the gentleman to his left in the brownish shirt, the paisley, and one of his mechanics, very skilled repairmen, is to the right. You can see all the inventory up there. This is not stuff that's been imported to be burnt. It's been imported to be reused. And it's been imported because it can be used cheaper, and it's believed to be massively pre-tested so it will last long. If it's been sitting and being used in an American's living room for 5 years, it's probably a pretty good computer. Down to Accra, just so you get a further sense of just how deep and important this business is. This is another business I spent time with. It's a company called Boogie Computers, right in the heart of Accra, in one of the hottest parts of town. And if you go inside, you can see they specialize in laptops, and they treat the laptops like a library. Somebody can come in and buy one of these. But more often than not, what you see going on is what's going on here. Somebody brings in their broken laptop. Say they have a broken Dell, broken Samsung laptop. A monitor has gone out. Bougie buys all of these laptops, and if they can't sell them, they keep them as a library, and they say, okay, well, your monitor is broken. We'll just take one off of this monitor, off of this laptop, and put it on here. Now, this is really interesting because this is something that you generally would not have done in the United States. It's a different way of thinking about stuff. Most of the computers on these shelves would be recyclables, or they would be tossables, if you will. Somebody would, toss them into their garbage, toss them into the landfill. We know that still goes on. But in Ghana in particular, this is valuable inventory. It's a means of ensuring that stuff lasts longer. It's stuff. It's not waste and recycling. And stuff lasts longer. The definition of stuff lasts longer. So an item like a laptop that might, only be used 3 to 5 years in the United States may have a 10, 15-year lifespan if we're talking about the parts inherent in them. And that's where I start thinking about the analogy we spoke of about Star Wars. Again, it's not looking at these things as the materials that they are, but looking at them as the value adds within them. What do these materials create, and what can they be used as? And that's what's happening in a place like Boogie Computers. Here's one of my favorite examples. This is a lovely man by the name of Ibrahim Il-Hassan, and he is the master TV repairman of Savalugu, Ghana. So if you go to the third largest city in Ghana, Tamale, which is in the north, it's about an hour flight north from the capital, and then you drive for about half an hour, 15 miles north from there, you are in Savalugu. Not a very affluent place, and you can see it's not affluent because they're still using tube televisions. They haven't converted over yet. And Mr. Al-Hassan spends his days largely fixing these tube televisions. It's not what he has always done. He started out repairing radios. I believe he's 50 years old now. Learned to repair tape decks, got to know how to repair VCRs. But the one consistent throughout his career is a need to fix tube televisions. And he is very, very good at it. The repair you see going on right here was brought to him on the day that I was there visiting him. And what it was, there was a chip broken on the motherboard, and the person who owned this television wanted to get it fixed. And so he was able to do that. And Ibrahim went to the guy and said, well, look, this is such an old TV. You have to actually change the channels manually. It had a dial on it. Tell you what, I can turn this into a remote controlled television. I've got a remote control. I can install the stuff into the TV, close it up, and instead of having to get up to change the channels from now on, you can actually just sit, in your Barca lounger and change channels. And they said yes. And the cost of the repair, I believe, with the parts was in the range of $5. And to buy that TV new up in northern Ghana would be about $15. And that TV was, best as we could tell, somewhere in the range of 30 to 35 years old. So it continues to last. Needless to say, if that TV were picked up anywhere in the United States, in North America, that TV would immediately go into the waste stream. But in Ghana, it continues to be stuff, and they continue, largely because of where incomes are, they continue to cultivate the skills to repair those things. And if you go to the back of any of these repair shops, and I just point out, if you look at Ibrahim's shop, if you look into the shed there, you can see several TVs sitting in back there just waiting to be cannibalized for parts. And here's another example. One of his friends who is nearby, I went and visited his shop, and he had the same store of stuff because you're starting to see flat screens moving into this region. And one of the things that they will say is, we can repair the stuff, we have the skills. The one thing we don't have is we don't have the parts. Sony and Samsung and whoever else, Hitachi and Hisense, any of these brands that make these flat screens, they're not exactly opening up authorized repair shops and parts distributorships in northern Ghana. So these guys are holding on to their TVs as tight as they can. And I should say, I just used the term guys. That's correct. In northern Ghana, at least, the repair profession is apprenticed, and because of sort of the traditional nature of the society there, it's all men who are apprenticed into the repair profession. Hopefully that'll change along the way. But when I say guys, I'm actually speaking accurately about the nature of the gender mix in the repair communities of northern Ghana. Here's Robin Ingenthron. And Robin has spent quite a bit of time in Ghana learning from his Ghanaian counterparts in waste and recycling and repair. This man, who he's standing with, Ishmael Rahman, is considered the most skilled repair man in all of Tamale, which is saying something because there are a lot of repairmen in Tamale. And Robin was visiting him with me. He was kind enough to take me along, and just learning what Ishmael was interested in, what kind of parts he needs, because it started occurring to Robin, maybe, he's got a lot of parts in his warehouse. Maybe he can supply some to Ishmael. Just to give you a sense of how sophisticated Ishmael is, he has this piece of Chinese equipment that allows him to repair the pins on damaged chips. And in fact, I had a laptop that I took to Ghana with me that had a damaged chip on it. He and somebody else was able to extract it and repair the pins on that chip and put it back into the laptop. That's just not something, I don't think you'll find many people with those skills or the equipment in the United States. But again, it's very much along the lines of let's extend our definition of stuff along the lines of duration. So let's go back to Robin's warehouse in Vermont now. After many years of looking around and seeing, what's going on in Ghana, and Robin's export business really didn't start just in Ghana. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, 3 decades ago. So he had started thinking about this a long time before, and he has exported electronics for reuse into other markets as well. But one of the things he started doing several years ago was doing what he saw people in Ghana doing, which was taking old televisions, instead of sending for recycling outright, he started taking them apart and holding on to the parts. And in his warehouse, he has a studio, and he has trained his people to take apart the televisions, even the ones that look like they've been run over by cars, and at least get whatever parts you can out of them. And then he markets them on eBay. And his business, selling these parts, something that he learned in developing countries, has grown thousandfold. It's a very, very profitable business now. And most of his business, selling on eBay and other platforms, is in North America, but not all of it. Here is Robin with Wahab Muhammad, and if you read my most recent book, you'll learn about Wahab. He's a native of Tamale, Ghana, and he's an electronics trader, used goods trader. He also deals in automobiles from North America. He will travel the United States. He'll go to Vermont, and he will buy electronics that he'll bring back to Ghana that he can resell in Tamale and in Accra to people who want low-cost, durable electronics. And here he is standing with Robin, and they're discussing, so it's not a posed photo, they're discussing the parts that Robin wants to start sending to Ghana as a pilot program, because one of the things that they lack in Ghana is parts to fix all of these electronics that they've been buying used from the United States and other places. Once they break, they have to get lucky and basically be able to cannibalize a television or a computer to get that correct part. And if they can't, it sits around and becomes inventory to be cannibalized, or ultimately it may end up being recycled in ways we don't like. So if those parts can flow there, they last longer. And so Robin, having spent a bunch of time in Ghana, saw parts that he thought might work for Ghana, and he's giving them to Wahab to take to Ghana to see if they can be marketed. And here is Wahab with Awudu Pan, who is one of the leaders of the Repair Guild in Kumasi, Ghana, which is the capital of repair in all of Ghana and arguably West Africa. And he's one of the leaders of the repair movement in West Africa, which is a movement of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of repair people. And Wahab, this is taken during a video call that Robin had, is going through these parts with him. They aren't doing this for charity. They aren't even doing this for the environment. They're doing this because it's a good business and there's demand there for these parts. Folks like Awudu want to make money making stuff last longer, and people in West Africa want their stuff to remain stuff. They don't want it to become waste and recycling. And so this is a route to doing that, and it's I think it's very exciting, and it's really taking off. So I want to finish, having shown you these stories and shown you how I've started reconsidering waste and recycling, I want to end this presentation with an image that will probably look terrifying and maybe make some folks want to shut off their monitors. But there's a point to this, because and that is, and I'll get to what the points are, but there's the initial point is that, we don't just need to learn, from the most advanced recycling systems. In many cases, what we really need to be doing is to be learning and to be rethinking on the basis of what's going on in emerging markets, because in many ways they're ahead of us on what it means to have a circular economy, to be thinking about stuff instead of waste and recycling. And this graph tells you that we are very far behind. What this shows you, and just to credit it briefly, this is done by Josh Lipowski, a brilliant academic who studies waste and recycling in Canada. He put this together. What this shows is the global e-waste trade flows in 1996. And let me explain what these colors mean. If you see a blue circle, that blue circle represents a country that exports electronics, used electronics. The bigger the circle, the more it exports. If you see a yellow circle, that's a country that imports electronics. The bigger the circle, the more it imports. Blue lines are developed countries sending used electronics to developed countries. Yellow lines are developing countries sending electronics to developing countries. And you can see, even in 1996, there was quite a bit of trade between these countries, sharing parts that could be used for repair, because certainly somebody on the Christmas Islands is not going to necessarily want to be dumping their electronics into Comoros. It's something that's bought and sold. And then the green lines are the ones that usually get the attention. That is the instance where you have a developed country sending used electronics to a developing country. So you see, and the thicker the line, any of these lines, the higher the volume. And so you see quite a bit of trade between, for instance, electronics being shipped from Australia to Indonesia. Now, Josh will be the first to tell you that this is an imperfect picture, but it gives you a fairly good idea of what was going on in 1996. Then you jump forward 16 years and look how the world has changed. You still see, blue and green lines, but what you see more of than ever before are yellow lines. That is emerging markets, developing countries sharing, trading electronics between each other. Why are they doing that? Is India dumping, its electronics on the Philippines? Absolutely not. What they're doing is saying, you have used stuff, I have used stuff, you have parts that I need to fix my stuff. And that's what's going on. And that's been going on for years. And I would argue that's what's been going on, in a sense, in the Star Wars universe, where you've developed these extraordinarily sophisticated repair communities. And increasingly, I think that's the kind of thinking that we're going to have in more developed countries and regions like the United States and the EU. You can't repair yourself out of every waste and recycling, problem and conundrum. But again, it's a good way to think about how waste and recycling is going and what we need to do. Ultimately, we need to reconceptualize our entire view of stuff. So I will end this with a picture of Ray. As I said, she's kind of my recycling hero, because it was really watching Ray, in episode 7, where I started rethinking how I view recycling and how I view stuff, not just viewing it as the raw materials or as the thing that needs to go into a landfill, as we traditionally do in this industry, but thinking about it more as stuff and how we extend the life of it. So I want to thank everybody at WasteExpo for inviting me to present to you. And I want to say again, I really hope we have the chance to meet in person, to talk about Star Wars, to talk about waste and recycling, and to talk about the future of stuff.
Adam, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was awesome. The journey, you really made us feel your journey. And then who knew how much we could learn about recycling from Star Wars?
I didn't know it either. It was a journey.
I love it. Well, thank you for that. I think our attendees learned a ton, and I know they have questions. So are you ready for some?
Bring them on.
All right, here's our first one. In your talk, you focused heavily on electronics. Can we think about other stuff in the same way? For example, do furniture and plates and bowls and the drawer full of pens in my desk at home also qualify?
There's some things that work better in this framework than others. I mean, that drawer full of pens, those were designed to be disposable. Those pens, most likely, most of them were. And I don't know that we're going to be able to reverse the course of things that were meant to be disposable. But there are a lot of things that we can start thinking about in different ways, less as future waste and recycling, as more as stuff that can have its life extended. Electronics are very obvious because they are very repairable technically, and they always have been. More more and more, I think we can be thinking of appliances that way. And I think we can reverse the course of how appliances have been thought of in recent years. I mean, there have been some recent great consumer surveys outside of the EU showing people are saying they're frustrated with their washing machines and their refrigerators because they're only lasting 3 to 5 years. Well, that's an easily fixable problem, fixable in more than one way. And I think that, starting to think of that again as stuff and not something that's bound for the landfill is really important. And you can do it with clothing as well. I mean, ultimately it gets to repair. I mean, we're seeing during COVID a lot of people taking up, the cause of mending and fixing their stuff. Now that's a small scale movement and it's not going to push back against, say, H&M. But again, the overall point is that people are starting to think more in terms of durability, in terms of their things lasting longer. And I believe they're starting to buy more in terms of things lasting longer. So yes, I think they can. And I think it means we're going to be looking at a more holistic vision of what waste and recycling are going forward, not just about the recycling plant and the waste plant, but how do we work with manufacturers to make these things, go in different directions.
Definitely. Well, thank you. And then our next question is more about facilities. Most waste and recycling facilities aren't set up for reusables. They're set up for waste and recycling. So is there a practical way for them to get involved in reuse without gumming up their traditional operations?
Well, I think one of the great opportunities that's really out there right now is for waste and recycling facilities specifically to be partnering up with thrift stores and especially chains like Goodwill and the Salvation Army. And I've been surprised, over the last couple of years as I did my most recent book, spending time, at the Salvation Armies and the Goodwills in particular, how little communication there was sort of between the recycling sector and that thrift sector. And I think there's a real opportunity to build some bridges there and to be able to, to divert reusables out of the waste stream into those traditional thrift environments. And that's not just something off the top of my head. It's actually something that's going on in Scandinavia, where you actually see recycling facilities setting up their own sort of thrift stores on site, where employees who are, say, on the MRF see something that can be pulled, or somebody on the truck sees something that can be pulled, and it goes into the thrift store instead of into the dumpster. And I think again, we're not going to make a huge dent necessarily in the waste stream, but then again, you never know. I mean, who would have thought that recycling 30 years ago, municipal recycling, would be making a big dent, and it has. So let's see where it goes. So I would love to see more communication and more partnering between the traditional thrift sector and the recycling sector, and the MRFs in particular, because I think there's a real opportunity there to accomplish some good.
Oh, definitely. And then how about on a regulatory level? Are there changes that could take place that would help promote reuse?
Well, I think the easy one, easy for me at least to come out and say I'm all about, is the right to repair movement. And I think everybody in waste and recycling knows what that is. But if the goal is to see our stuff last longer, then you got to give people the right to repair it, and you got to give them access to repair parts. And so I won't make a hard political push for right to repair, but it is in dozens of states now. There's a bill at the federal level, and it just does two things. One, it says you can have independent repair shops that have access to the same parts as the authorized one. And it also says that the documentation, any repair documentation, any sort of diagnostics have to be made available to everybody. That a manufacturer can't say to somebody, sorry, if you want to get that repaired, you have to come and spend $50 for us to plug something in to tell you what's wrong with it. Everybody should have access to that stuff. And I think that will help waste and recycling on levels that we're only beginning to imagine.
Oh, I hope so. And then practically speaking, this is our last question.
Sure.
What's the long-term outlook for electronics reuse? Is it something that waste and recycling professionals will be adopting on a mass basis?
Well, I think it's going to be a really interesting evolution over the next few years. One of the things that we're seeing happening right now is sort of electronics themselves sort of adopting, the consumer electronics adopting the used car model. So for example, if you go to an Apple store and you have an old phone in your pocket, you can trade it in for credit on a new iPhone. And that's the same thing I did with a used car. I took it in and I traded it in and I got credit and, lowered my cost of buying a new car. And I think as the price of consumer electronics, especially handhelds, moves up, you're going to see more and more demand for those used devices. What my concern is, and maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not, I haven't fully decided yet, is that you're going to see this become very centralized. Just sort of like you have with the used car businesses. Of course, you do see some independent car lots, but they're not necessarily the most trusted source to buy your used car. Where do you want to buy your used car? You want to buy your used car from the dealership, because they'll give you the warranty. And so I'm not sure where that's going quite yet, but my sense tells me that you're going to see the big electronics manufacturers and the people they designate be the folks who are controlling this. And I think the waste and recycling professionals out there who find used phones in their supply chain will find themselves selling into those sorts of entities.
Okay, great. Well, Adam, thank you so much. This has been so inspiring, and what a great way to kick off our day of learning. And we really can't thank you enough for pivoting and going digital with us. It has been such a treat.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I hope, down the line I can pivot and be there in person. I'd really love to do it.
Oh, let's hope so. Hey, we're back in Vegas in 21, so we will be inviting you for sure.
Okay, great, Liz.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching.